Leite in the attack zone, off the boards for Ingram. Blocked once, twice. Towed out to Trelecky with 12 seconds left. Tries to turn it inside. Stan holding it along the near board. Still with it on the left side. A shot. Save Van Aaron with 5 seconds left. He's going to hold on to the ball. Baltimore will go into the playoffs. And despite a great effort tonight by the Pittsburgh Spirit, they will lose the way they have lost a lot of games this year. Hard luck, great goaltending, could not get the big goal to win the game in support of Dave Bursic, but they did not quit at all tonight. They came back several times, and it goes right down to the final 5 seconds of play before you can say that the Spirit are actually eliminated. Stay with us. John Sanders and I will be back to do some recapping and say some thank yous when we return. The season is over on Pittsburgh Spirit Soccer.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
All right, everybody, how's it going? Let's get this show on the road, shall we? And I am so happy that you have joined us once again for another fun-filled and certainly exciting episode, of course, of Good Seats Still Available. Yes, that is our curious little podcast journey that we do weekly to explore what used to be in professional sports. We are in the midst of the quadrennial mania that is the FIFA World Cup, which starts later this week. We do have soccer on the brain. We often do, but perhaps no more often than we do perhaps this week and the weeks to follow. Unfortunately, the United States, neither Italy or the Netherlands for that matter, some other big powerhouses, are participating this year, but it doesn't mean that the excitement is going to be any less. Matter of fact, I think it's going to be quite the tournament on a whole number of fronts. And the reason that we mention it is not only because of the excitement, but because of this week's special guest. His name is JP Dellacamera. And of course, if you have followed the sport of soccer in any way, shape, or form in this country over the last, 30 years, you know JP's voice as the signature dulcet toned voice of the sport of soccer in this country. Has been a part of half dozen World Cups now, major international tournaments, women's World Cups, and European Championship calls, and Major League Soccer. And as we're going to get into our conversation today, a whole bunch of different things in his early days in the career that has wended and winded through many various ports of call, especially in that of hockey. He was the voice of the Atlanta Thrashers for a bunch of years. Remember them? Yes, now the Winnipeg Jets that just missed out, the second incarnation of such, to get into the Stanley Cup this year. But JP Dellacamera was the voice of that team and all the excitement that was there. But JP also has a rich history in a lot of different sports, but certainly soccer. And we get into it. A lot of sort of the dusty nooks and crannies that got JP on the road to being basically the dean of soccer broadcasters in this country. We go back to 1978, if you can believe it, the Detroit Express of the old North American Soccer League, the Pittsburgh Spirit and the MISL, the league, as well as the team. JP was an instrumental part of. We get into WUSA women's soccer, the strongly hoped for and well-funded league that came off the heels of the 1999 Women's World Cup, that of the famous Brandy Chastain penalty kick overtime goal and famous sports bra, and the call, of course, by JP Dellacamera of that match, that quintessential match. Another quintessential match that JP called was in 1989, proverbially known as the shot heard round the world, with Paul Caligiuri and the U.S. national team qualifying in Trinidad and Tobago in late 1989 for the 1990 World Cup in Italy. JP was at the behind the mics with that for that, along with Seamus Mallon, for that instrumental game that certainly, as you'll hear in this conversation, set the tone for a renewal and a whole nother level for the sport of soccer in this country. It's a very fun and interesting conversation with probably the most well-known and steady voices in the sport of soccer, and of course in hockey too. That is JP Dellacamera. He'll be calling a whole bunch of games for Fox Sports and the FIFA World Cup coming up later this week And he is our special guest, and we encourage you to stay for a few minutes, almost an hour or so, for a very fun chat with JP in just a couple of seconds. Let's see. So a couple of promotional items. Let's sweep these away, shall we, as quickly as possible. Let's get to the good stuff after that. Audibletrial.com/good seats. If you are traveling to the World Cup or you're contemplating a cross-country trip and just need some stuff to keep you occupied during those long hours of travel, well, what better way to do that than, well, aside from listening to your favorite podcast, of course, an audiobook or two or seven or perhaps one of under 180,000 titles to choose from our friends at Audible. And if you go to audibletrial.com/good seats, you will get a free audiobook download to give it a try for yourself. You also get a free month of the service. And of course, you get to see all the various titles and genres and things that are out there for you to discover in the world of audiobooks. Audible is arguably the preeminent source of audiobooks. And at audibletrial.com/good seats, it's your way to sample it, get a free audiobook for you to listen to and enjoy. You can cancel at any time. Again, I stress that you can cancel at any time. So give it a shot. Get your downloaded audiobook, give it a listen. I think you'll enjoy it as much as I do. I love audiobooks, and Audible is, I can't think of any other better entity than to access and to deliver and for you to enjoy the magic that is our whatever, audiobooks, of course. Audibletrial.com/good seats, and give that a try. We appreciate you doing so. We also appreciate you giving our friends at sportshistorycollectibles.com a try as well. And for those who have listened to the show before, you will know that at sportshistorycollectibles.com is a treasure trove of all kinds of sports memorabilia, both for teams and leagues that no longer exist, as well as teams and leagues that are in different incarnations. There's a whole raft of stuff, and there's new inventory there every week. We encourage you to go try it. And of course, when you're there at sportshistorycollectibles.com, please be, by all means, make sure that you use the promo code GOODSEATS. The promo code GOODSEATS. And what are you going to get for that using that little code? You're going to get 15% off all of your purchases. That's sportshistorycollectibles.com. Use your promo code GOODSEATS and enjoy 15% off all of your purchases, courtesy of us or your friends here at Good Seats, still available. Thanks so much for giving them a try as well. All right, let us waste no more time. Let us get into a very fun, very interesting, and a very revelatory conversation with the Dean of Soccer Broadcasters here in this United States, and the preeminent voice that you will hear during Fox Sports' coverage of the FIFA World Cup. His name is JP Dellacamera. It was an honor to have a conversation with him, and here it is. I'm very curious as to sort of how you even got involved in this wacky business of sports broadcasting, and maybe perhaps a little bit of background as to what your childhood was like and what you were thinking about career-wise, and did you have a plan at all when you kind of stumbled into this, or maybe you did?
Well, I grew up in the Boston area, and Boston is a great sports city today. It was also a great sports city back in the day when I was growing up. So you had Patriots were nowhere near what they are today, but Red Sox were obviously a very popular team then. But the most popular team back then, and not the Celtics who were winning championships, but actually the Boston Bruins. So I grew up first as a hockey fan, more than a soccer fan. We didn't really have much soccer going on there, but back in those days, the NASL was trying to get something going. You had another league going on at the same time. There were two competing leagues. And I remember going to Boston, to Fenway Park, actually, to watch a team play. It was a team mostly made up of players from other countries. And the sport just kind of grew on me. I wasn't a big baseball guy because I thought baseball doesn't have much pace to it. There's so much time between pitches and then innings and so many breaks and trips to the mound and all that, whereas soccer seemed to be more like hockey, not the speed of it, but in the sense that players are always moving, the ball is always moving, there was constant motion, and I think that's where I fell in love with it.
You said the old Fenway Park. Was that sort of the early days of the old NASL, like the Boston Beacons? I'm guessing, right? Or
that's the team that it was. It was the Boston Beacons, and some things you can remember very well, and some things you can't. I'm going to throw out a name. The goalkeeper was Walt Tarnowski.
Nice.
That's the only name I can remember, though. Sorry, but that's the only name I can remember.
Well,
but they did play some games, at least in Fenway Park. That's where I went to watch them.
Yeah, and we've actually had a couple of conversations about the old United Soccer Association and the old NPSL, National Professional Soccer League, obviously the two predecessors to what ultimately became the NASL. As you sort of went to those games and obviously sort of immersed yourself in sort of Boston sports culture, I guess, when did you kind of have the inkling that this thing might actually lead to a career, this interest in sports? And I mean, were you a broadcast guy? What was your sort of sensibilities?
Yeah, I went to a college that's no longer there, called Graham. It was Graham Junior College. It was a 2-year school. I got my associate's degree in communications. We had our own television station. We had our own radio station. So I did a show there. It was called Sports Hot Seat. And it was like a half-hour conversation with various sports people. We ended up getting some, fairly good guests. The teams were very cooperative in the Boston area, so we got some good guests on the show. And we also would go out and actually do remotes. So I did some, remote hockey games at crazy hours, like at 10 o'clock at night when we could get the ice where Boston University was playing. And our team wasn't very good, so the games were challenging to do. So I did get some experience there. But when I first went to Graham, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to be on television. I knew I wanted my career to have something to do with either sports or music, because those were my two loves. But I think, by the time I made the decision to go to Graham, I would say when I actually made that decision, then I knew that it was going to be sports. I think I got rid of the music bug by that point, because I thought, nobody wants to listen to, somebody in their 70s or, late 70s on the radio, and radio stations don't want to hire people that age. Whereas in sports, I could see there were a lot of old timers that were still calling games at that age. So I thought it's a longer career, and I did like sports more than music. So I decided to go for it. But my first real experience was really minor league hockey. And that's what I thought I was going to be, minor league hockey guy, and then hopefully an NHL broadcaster. That was always the dream growing up in Boston with Bobby Orr and Phil Esposito. It was never about soccer or any other sport. I was going to be a hockey guy.
Well, it's clear that hockey obviously has been part of your career as well throughout. But maybe how did you sort of get that sort of first gig and perhaps that sort of hefty dollop of courage, to be on the air and have confidence to call the games and not listen to your voice and get all flustered and all that kind of stuff, which can be pretty heady stuff when you're that young. You have an idea, but you not necessarily the right tape or the experience, so to speak, right?
I always had confidence. It was all, to me, I'm like the young guy of today. There's a lot of good young broadcasters out there that have a lot of confidence, but it's all about getting the opportunity. And back then, we didn't have the opportunities that the young kids have today. I tell college kids now, here's the good and the bad. The good is that there are so many more jobs available to you right now, much more than I had growing up in my era. But the bad news is that there's a lot more competition now, because more people want to be on the air, more people want to do sports. So I think you're going up against a more crowded field. So I think you have to be even better today than maybe before. Maybe I could be wrong on that, but that's just my take on it. So I think that when you look at those situations, who's going to give you a chance? And you had to start like low, minor league hockey. You did a lot of traveling. When I was first married, when my daughter was 8 years old, we had lived in I think it was 8 years. We had lived in 8 different places, not different cities, but different apartments or a house or wherever, because that was the life of a minor league hockey broadcaster. And, if I fast forward to when I made the transition, let's say from hockey to soccer, it was after doing minor league hockey for 10 years and thousands of bus miles, I thought, it's time to maybe do something else. And at that time, indoor soccer was becoming a fairly popular thing. And I thought, well, indoor soccer is a lot like hockey on grass. And back in those days, the hockey coaches our indoor soccer coaches rather, would get conversations going with the hockey guys because they would design their power plays on a similar basis, and line changes and things like that. So there were a lot of similarities there. And going back to, I want to say 1982, sometimes it's hard to remember exact dates, but in 82, there was a team in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Spirit. They were owned by the DeBartolo family, who also owned the Penguins, Civic Arena at that time it was called. I think they owned the 49ers also at that time. And I thought, there's a job open there. I could move from radio to television. I'll be flying instead of being on the bus. And I thought, indoor soccer was a great sport. And that's probably where, even though I had done some other outdoor college games, not a lot, but I had done some other work, but I would say that's where the soccer conversion probably got a big kickstart, no pun intended.
All right. Well, before we get to the Igloo, we're going to take you there live in a second. You did mention, and I think I saw this in a Soccer America article recently, that wasn't your first dalliance with broadcasting the sport of soccer, right? Had you had a little bit of outdoor, even NASL experience, or how did you kind of get your first taste on the air with that?
Ironically, back in those days, there's no computers, right? So you're not emailing people; you're actually calling people to check on work. So I'm calling the Detroit Express. I can't remember, why I called them, other than they were a new team, and I was looking for television work, and whoever I spoke to at the time, now that I think of it, it was Roger Faulkner, who still has done a lot of things in the Detroit area with soccer. Talked to him on the phone, and they said that they were not looking for a TV guy, but their first two games, they were going to have the games on radio, and they needed somebody to do those first couple of games. And I literally talked my way into it. I had no real experience. I can't remember why they would have hired me or taken a chance, other than, maybe they were up against it, maybe it was late, but whatever happened, I did the first two games in Detroit Express history anyway. Trevor Francis was on that team. I think Keith Furphy, was on that team. There were a bunch of names from that era. My first game was in Tulsa, and the second one was in Fort Lauderdale. Those were my first two, and I enjoyed it. Enjoyed it immensely. And then after that, 1980, I did some outdoor soccer for the Pennsylvania Stoners, American Soccer League. They won a championship in 80. And I still think they were the first team, had the name on the jersey, unless somebody else has another one. Alpo was a big sponsor, and they were local. They were in either Allentown or Bethlehem as the main headquarters. So, and it was not big money at the time, but whatever it was big for the American Soccer League. So they had Alpo in the jersey. And I remember people were making fun of it, and there would be jokes about the teams going to the dogs and all that stuff. But it helped keep the team in business. And in some ways, that team was a little bit ahead of the curve.
Oh, no doubt. And having grown up in the northern New Jersey area myself, certainly very familiar with obviously the NASL and the Cosmos and the teams playing in there, but also the Stoners as well. I am curious because, having had a little taste of what I guess then that was at its maximum, right? 24 teams in the North American Soccer League at that point. And then the ASL, which was sort of this, newly rechristened professional league. Obviously it had kicked around for many, many years earlier on, mostly as an ethnic sort of regional kind of thing. But then, as the NASL sort of got going, the ASL sort of fancied itself almost as a professional-like circuit as well. Did you any early recollections of sort of the differences or the zeitgeist of each of those leagues and your perceptions of, albeit in early form, what pro soccer was sort of like and going to be? Did you see there was a long-term future here, or were you suspicious, or just hungry for a job and not caring really about what the future was?
Yeah, I think it was the latter. When you see something happening, in front of you, I don't think, like even Major League Soccer, 1996 when they started, right, when they had the big press conference in New York City the year before, it was a big gala that they had in the city, and I don't think anyone sitting there no matter who it was, would have said, when you get down to like 2018, you're going to have this many teams. You're going to have this many new stadiums. You're going to have state-of-the-art training facilities. You're going to pay $15 million to get a player. David Beckham's going to come here. Like, nobody would have guessed that, right? And I think that's where I was probably back in those days in the 80s, where I'm thinking, yeah, there's an NASL, there's a American Soccer League, but, this is what it is, right? The media coverage was not big. The crowds, except for probably the Cosmos, were not huge in a lot of places. But going back to your earlier point about like maybe what the differences were, American Soccer League had some very good players and very good coaches. I liken it to today, right, where you have MLS, you had /have NASL. I mean, they're in limbo right now, and USL, right? I covered the Cosmos in the new era of the NASL. That was a very good team. They won a couple of titles while I was calling their games. They were a very competitive team under Giovanni Savarese. On its day, that team could compete with MLS teams. So I think that the difference in the leagues back then is the difference in the leagues now. It's all about the money. Mm-hmm. So take away the money, take away the big money players, and the rest of the lineup, you can make a comparison. Back in those days, the American Soccer League never got as much credit for being as good of a league as they were. And in our modern time here, the NASL never got the credit that they should have. That was a good league. And personally, for the players' sake, I do hope it comes back.
Yeah, I do too. And I also want to spend some more time on some more episodes on the ASL, especially in the 70s and early 80s, because indeed, you even had coaches like Eddie Firmani, who coached the New Jersey Americans after the Cosmos for a while. And yeah, I think Al Troutwig got his start calling the New York Apollo games out on Long Island.
He did. Do you know who the first commissioner was? I mean, that I can remember, not the first commissioner of the league, but when I was involved, the commissioner of the league was Bob Cousy, the former Celtic great.
Who is still with us, by the way. Now, I don't know what state he is. And
I thought he was, but I wasn't sure. But, I mean, that was amazing, right? They went and they paid him at that time, from what I understand, a good amount of money, because they thought, even though he did not have a soccer background, that, his name would resonate back then. I mean, that was the thought process.
Yeah, well, we'll have a few more. We did an episode on the Cincinnati Comets for a couple of years, which is probably before the mid-'70s and stuff. But yeah, there's some very interesting stories there that I think, as Major League Soccer continues to root itself, and now with the USL, and maybe even a USL Division III, and perhaps whatever becomes of the NASL, and there certainly is that infrastructure, right? And we'll get into that in a little bit when we get maybe to your views about the sport, but. Yeah. There's no doubt the infrastructure is getting much, much deeper, and, names and heritage. And I think people it'd be very interesting to sort of see how that heritage, that history sort of gets, shall we say, rediscovered. And it's been rediscovered in pockets for sure.
Yeah. I mean, we see teams that come in now to MLS, go back to the old NASL names, like the Sounders, like the Timbers, they embrace that tradition. Others want to go their own way, like Atlanta just went with Atlanta United. They didn't want to go back to some of the names of their past in Atlanta soccer history. It's whatever the club decides to do. But I always found that fascinating. And that's why I liked it when the Cosmos came back, because they are the iconic brand. They are the name. There are probably people overseas right now that when they hear the name New York Cosmos, that means probably more to them than any MLS team does. Even though the Cosmos of the last few years in the NASL and now in Cosmos B are obviously nowhere near what an MLS team is like. But more people probably you name the country, more people would be more familiar with the New York Cosmos than the MLS defending champions Toronto FC.
Yeah, we even had a couple of weeks ago, we had a guy named Waylon Moore on our show. He was the guy who actually created the logo back in the day.
Really?
Yeah, and it's the iconography and to your point, right? The team has come back in various flavors and hopefully will again at a senior level again. And that logo just resonates, right? And it stands for something both past and maybe in the future. So
It does. I grew up as a Cosmos fan. I never did Cosmos games until the reboot era, but I enjoyed watching Jim Carvelis, the late Jim Carvelis, and Seamus Mallon doing games. I mean, I enjoyed them, and then later I got a big kick out of working with Seamus on many soccer games. But I used to always watch the Cosmos when I was doing minor league hockey. Back then they were on what was called WOR, I think Channel 9 out of New York.
Yep.
And whatever we had back then, it was not DirecTV or Dish or any of that, but whatever we had on our cable system, we were able to get Cosmos games in Erie, Pennsylvania. So doing minor league hockey, still was watching Cosmos games and getting my fix of soccer that way.
I think Carvelis was still, even to this day, one of the sort of iconic soccer broadcasters ahead of his time, and obviously a lot of other sports experience. But the two of them, I mean, Seamus and Carvelis were just, I think, frankly, borderline legendary. Maybe because I was a kid at the time, maybe. But you go back, a lot of the broadcasts, they still hold up. The excitement. I could make the argument that a lot of MLS broadcasters could use a little videotape from the old Carvelis Mallon days.
Yeah, it'd be nice to give it a listen. I enjoyed it then. I'm sure if I listen now, I would enjoy it as well. But they, WOR back then, probably had production values back in those days. You can't compare it to now. Obviously, with them with cameras and the HD and all that. But back then, for their era, that was a high quality television show. So when they put that on, that was really like a network game for us to watch.
All right. Well, so let's get into your Pittsburgh days, because in many respects, it seems to me that your hockey experience, and you kind of alluded to it earlier, it was almost sort of a natural fit or overlap, if you will, with this fledgling thing called the Major Indoor Soccer League, which wasn't even a real sport until 1978, 79. I mean, it had some indoor, dalliances with the NASL years prior, but maybe you can give our audience a bit of a sense of sort of how you came to discover this frenetic indoor version of the sport, and how that parlayed into, or how you parlayed that growth into a gig which was relatively long lasting. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, you correct me if I'm wrong, kind of put you and soccer kind of together almost inextricably, and sealing that for your future, no?
Yeah, no, I would say that's true. I think that living in Erie, we were 2 hours away from Pittsburgh, but back then, in the early days of the old MISL, you had celebrity people involved. Like Pete Rose was an owner of the Cincinnati Kids, I think was their name at that time.
Correct, sir.
You had families like the DeBartolos that were getting involved. You had some big people from other sports that wanted to get in on this, and I thought, for the people that thought outdoor soccer was boring, maybe this is something that they would like, It had more action. Because people back then, just like today, some people will say, well, there's not enough goals, there's not enough this, whatever their complaint is. But back then, plenty of goals, right? And it was fast moving. It was, like I said, it was like hockey on grass, right? So I know what a hockey power play looks like, and we would do the same thing with soccer. So the transition was easy, I would say. And back then, and this is what maybe your younger listeners won't remember, the highest drawing indoor team, attendance-wise, do you know who that was in the 80s?
I want to say it was the St. Louis Steamers, no?
Right. Highest indoor, I'm saying any sport. Any sport. They outdrew NHL and NBA the 1 year when they were at their height. Because back then, I think the Checkerdome was like maybe a 19,000-seater, something like that. And I think the second most attendance figure was Edmonton when they had Gretzky there. But there was a period of time where the number one spectator sport attendance-wise for all of the indoor sports was MISL and St. Louis Steamers. So fast forward to that, because there is a hockey connection here. I'm trying to remember these things. You're asking me some good questions that's making me think here. Going back to those days,
we do nothing. If anything, we challenge our guests to revel in the past.
Okay.
And hopefully they're all positive memories, JP.
Yeah, no, it's good. It's good. So back then and even now, Mike Lang, who I think is a legendary, fantastic announcer with the Pittsburgh Penguins, was doing their games. Now he's doing radio. Back then he was doing TV and radio. I think they were simulcasting back then. But Mike was doing some freelance soccer work with Anheuser-Busch, Bud Sports. He was filling in on some games that they had. And they wanted Mike to do some indoor games as a backup in St. Louis. And Mike said to me one day, he said, they want me to do it. He said, but I'm not really interested. He said, if you're interested, I can put you in touch with them. And I said, sure, absolutely interested. And so Mike put me in touch with Bud Sports, who was doing St. Louis Steamers games at the time. They called me in. I was the backup announcer to Bob Carpenter, another very excellent announcer.
Sure.
Doesn't get his due, but Bobby was great with basketball, football, baseball. I think he still does baseball with the Washington Nationals, if I'm not mistaken. And Bob has a nice gig going. He's the voice of the St. Louis Steamers. He's from that area, the Midwest area. But Bob got another contract offer, and he left as I was his backup. And, the chips seemed to fall my way because I went from his backup to his successor, and we're talking 1986, and here's the World Cup coming. So the timing was right, and that's how I got my first, I would say, big gig, which was to be, one of the announcers, the only announcer, I guess, only play-by-play guy back in those days. 1986 World Cup. Bud Sports had the rights. They got it on ESPN. It was 3 in the booth off the monitor, me, Shep Messing, and Seamus Mallon.
Very interesting. So that almost sort of solidified you almost became sort of the default, if you will, voice of soccer in this country, almost by design or unwittingly. It's an interesting.
Well,
dynamic.
I think you have to. Yeah, it's a good question too, because I think you could say by design, but you also have to be lucky, right? I mean, if Mike Lang doesn't make that intro, maybe somebody else gets it. If Bob Carpenter doesn't get a job offer, I think at the time it was Lorimar Productions. If Bob doesn't get that offer, maybe Bob is the soccer guy now. Maybe he never does the other stuff. But back in those days, you'd have to Google this. I don't remember how many games we did, but it was not a lot of games. I want to say maybe like 15 games, something like that. And I think NBC had other games as well, but we didn't even do half of the games of the World Cup back then. But back then, I became the voice because there was so little soccer going on then, right? So it was indoor soccer. So if you're the voice of the MISL game of the week, you're the voice of soccer, like automatically. And ironically, I ended up going into other sports like college basketball because I thought to myself, there's so little soccer on TV, and right now I'm the guy. But what if next week I'm not the guy, or next year I'm not the guy? Now I'm an unemployed soccer guy with no other real experience. So that's when I started doing other sports more intently or intensely, like college basketball. And then I got some freelance hockey work as well. And that's what I did. And then you fast forward later, I ended up getting my NHL hockey gig with the Atlanta Thrashers. But I'm skipping a couple of decades there, I guess, with that story.
No, that's fine. I before we leave that decade, though, any sort of gauzy memories of the major indoor soccer league generally? I mean, you mentioned St. Louis, obviously Kansas City and Pittsburgh. Some of the crowds and the freneticism and the, it's just wild times. I mean, the sort of human pinball element and the showcase, the lie wikis, with the steam and the disco lights and all this kind of stuff. What did you think you stumbled into here? I mean, besides sort of being that voice, right? Was this WWE like, or was this kind of like really cool?
No, because this was real. No, this was real. There was no script to this, but the live wikis were fantastic marketers of the sport. I think MISL knew how to promote it. Like in Pittsburgh, the theme was Hot Legs, and the Rod Stewart song would come out. That was how we went with our TV commercials. That's how the music was played at the arena. I think when they came out for the opening introductions, they came through an open ball or something like that, and the music was from Fame, just the music as the players were introduced. But what I do remember is Pittsburgh, Cleveland, whenever they played, especially in Cleveland, couldn't get a ticket. Cavaliers were getting 7,000, 8,000 people a game. Cleveland folks was filling the building. The best players were playing indoors. So if you picture today with the great players we have in Major League Soccer, that would be like if those guys went and played indoors, that's what you'd have. Because we had players that, again, the younger people don't know who these players are, but like a Steve Jungle, fantastic. Branko Segota, fantastic. The late Stan Terlecki, sorry to see that he passed away recently, an unbelievable talent, the stuff that these guys could do. And they were all outdoor players, but they wanted to come to America, and it was soccer that was paying at that time. It was low, but it was still six figures. Some of those guys were 100,000 a year players. Stan was probably, I'm going to guess, over two. We had Paul Child that was playing there. There were so many great names. Preki was like 18 or 19 years old when he came over, and he was fantastic to watch. So I remember the atmosphere in a lot of these buildings was crazy, like it is in the other sports. I remember the great players that we had, all the stories, all the characters, from the legendary coach Don Popovic to his running battles all the time with his best player Steve Jungle, the television games that we did. There was a lot of good things that we had. And at one time in Pittsburgh, the Pittsburgh Spirit outdrew the Pittsburgh Penguins. And it wasn't by a great margin, and it's not like we were both doing well, but maybe the Spirit was about maybe 8,000 or 9,000 a game, and the Penguins were about 7,000 or 8,000. But we were outdrawing them. And then Pittsburgh signed a guy named Mario Lemieux, and then it all changed. But before Mario, Pittsburgh Spirit had better attendance figures than the Pittsburgh Penguins.
Yeah, I think we had Doug Verb on a couple episodes ago, and he's actually putting together an MISL reunion sometime. I think it's in December in Las Vegas, something that I want to hopefully be part of and maybe attend and stuff. But everybody I talk to, in the related to or part of the old MISL, there's nothing but amazing stories and memories, and just about the intensity, the high caliber player. Obviously, the fact that there was really, especially in the mid to later 80s, no real top tier professional outdoor version of the sport. Right. And the fans just they ate it up, and the excitement was there, was almost made for television, and frankly, the innovations too, right? The introductions during before the game, and those kinds of things are things that actually are part of pro sports now. People just take for granted.
Yeah, I think Tim Lewicki back in those days used to say, before you can sell the steak, you would sell the sizzle. What's the thing people more involved in the game, and back then too. Players did a ton of work in the community. They were making appearances all over the place. And soccer players, like hockey players, are, the greatest people, the most accessible people, probably the most humble of all of the athletes. So, they did it, and they enjoyed being a part of the community. And we found, and we still find today, soccer players that play in various cities, when they retire, instead of going back to their native country or where they were born in the States, stay in that area and become part of the fabric of that soccer club.
Well, clearly, though, you're obviously getting attention not only for your indoor chops, but also your ability to call the international version of the game. And you mentioned 86 was a very limited, yet growing window for the sport. But make no mistake, right? I think quintessentially, you will always be connoted with a very famous event leading up to the 1990 World Cup, and that is obviously Trinidad and Tobago in 1989. Maybe you can give our audience a bit of a sense of sort of what World Cup qualifying was like in the late 80s, and you being effectively the voice of U.S. soccer to the point of it being, how big an audience that is. You sort of alluded to it before. Did you did you know at calling that game and Caligiuri's goal in particular that that something, on another level was starting to occur, or was that again just simply a gig and you were just calling the action like you saw it, being the pro soccer player you were?
I live in the moment. So I didn't know. The only thing we all knew was that the U.S. was going to qualify now for the 1990 World Cup. That's all that we really knew at that time, right? Would the 94 World Cup be successful? Would the U.S. qualify for future World Cups? Would they start a brand new outdoor league? Who knew, right? Those were the stories that were going on at the time. But I just remember whenever I do speaking engagements, I don't do many. I don't think that's one of the things that I'm good at. But when I do speaking engagement, I talk about two games. One of them is the one you're referring to, and the other one is the 1999 Women's World Cup final, because those are memories of not just the game itself, but the lead up to the game. So I can remember for Trinidad and Tobago, knowing people were asking me back then, can the U.S. win this? They have to win the game, right? A draw does them no good. And I said, I'm glad it's like that, because I said, at that time, I don't think our guys know how to play for a draw. It's not in our culture. Americans are used to winning, going for the win. So I said, I'm glad that a draw doesn't do it. And I said, we have a young kid in goal, Tony Miola, very confident kid. And I said, I think we can get it done. I don't think they're going to score against them. So I do think we can get it done. That was always my thought. So going back to Trinidad and Tobago, I can remember flying in there into their country. Back then, I don't know if you can still do this in Trinidad. I know you can't do it in the States anymore after 9/11, but there were fans there yelling and screaming, loud music, that met the team at the airport. I can remember that almost as if it was yesterday. I can remember going to the hotel. I can remember noise around the hotel. I remember that when we went to the stadium, or before we went to the stadium, our producer, normally we would go to a game, let's say 2 hours before the game. And our producer says, I know you guys aren't going to like this, he said, but here's what time you need to be at the game. And I want to say it was like 5 hours before the game. And I said, this was a producer, Jim Maroney was his name. He too has since passed away. But Jim looked at me and he said, JP, I know you don't want to come 5 hours early, but he said, I'm going to tell you this. He said, if you come 5 hours early, I can promise you that you will call this game. He said, if you come 2 hours early, I can't even promise that you get into the stadium. He said, there's only so many seats that are available. He said, and at some point, they're not letting people in. So he said, it's up to you. And I said, okay, I'll be there 5 hours early. And I wondered, would I be stale? Like, what's it going to be like? You're never at a game that early. And they let people in several hours before kick. They played music. It'd be like bringing a tailgate party inside for 4 or 5 hours. The music never stopped. I enjoyed watching it. I think it uplifted me. I think that I just soaked it all in, everything from the people in the seats early, everyone dressed in red, except for 1 or 2 rows of USA fans and dignitaries, but the rest of the stadium was red, and the stadium was packed several hours before kick. And those are the things that I remember about it. I remember Caligiuri's goal. It seemed to come out of nowhere. I remember the day before in a taxi seeing that not only did people think this was a huge deal, they painted their houses red. They painted their cars red. Like, we don't do that here in this country. We paint our faces red for sporting events or whatever color your team is, right? But we don't. Imagine telling your wife you're going to paint the house whatever because your team is playing that day. Like, it was weird. It was strange, but it was a long-lasting memory. I've never forgotten that. To think that somebody would paint their car or their house based on like one game, and they declared the next day it was declared a national holiday in Trinidad because they thought they were going to win the game. So it was a long night, and I remember how happy everyone was in the end. We had a lot of the players' parents were at the game and at the hotel, and I'm sure even they never knew how far this would go. We joked back then that the Caligiuri goal was the shot heard around the world, but when I talk in front of groups now, I call it the $1 billion goal, because I think that if you look at what has happened since, all the World Cups that we've qualified for, Major League Soccer starting, expansion fees, television money, sponsorship, $1 billion is nothing. I mean, that goal made it all happen, gave us the momentum, gave us, the Nike contract, gave us everything that we have today, all because of that. He doesn't score there, where's the interest come 94? I mean, we're still going to sell out stadiums, but, do we have MLS? I don't know.
All right, just when it was getting interesting, let's bring this to a grinding halt, shall we? Just kidding. We got to pay the bills around here, and our friends at Audible have been very helpful in attempting to allow us to pay some of those bills, and we want to call them out now and remind you that a free audiobook download is yours for the taking, and also a free 1-month subscription to the service of Audible at audibletrial.com/goodseats. Again, audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 1-month trial of the Audible service, and most interestingly, a free audiobook download for you to enjoy. 180,000 titles and growing every day to choose from, and there's absolutely no excuse to not find at least one title amongst that cavernous selection available to you that you won't find to be enjoyable and good for the soul, including a couple of books that might be interesting to our audience. And yes, some new ones, frankly, that I'm finally listening to. One that I'm listening to right now is by Carson Cunningham. It's narrated by Paul Bamer, and it's called Underbelly Hoops, Adventures in the CBA, a.k.a. the Crazy Basketball Association, which is really, of course, about the Continental Basketball Association, which for many years was sort of this ragtag minor league of the NBA. And it's a book I'm about 2 chapters into right now, and hopefully maybe a guest will get for a future episode. Also, in my queue, next up, is another guest that I'd like to get, and her book that she wrote is also narrated by her. Her name is Jeannie Buss, and of course, Jeannie is the daughter of Jerry Buss, of course, the wildly successful founder of the Los Angeles Lakers and the LA Forum, and Jeannie is clearly today the brains behind the Los Angeles Lakers today. She and her brothers were active, of course, in things like, along with her father, World Team Tennis, the Major Indoor Soccer League with the LA Lasers, all kinds of stuff. So her book is next on my list. That's called Laker Girl, and that too is available on Audible. And again, it's one of the many thousands of titles that you can choose from when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. And again, you too can get your free audiobook download to give it a try, perhaps one of those 2, or perhaps one of the other 180,000 titles available to you as well. Give it a try, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Thanks for listening, and back to our conversation. Well, it's also interesting, too, because having seen that game live and knowing how rare a broadcast like that was at the time, right? I mean, having been an abandoned NASL fan as a kid and as a young adult, not much to sort of fall back on aside from the indoor game, which is exciting and whatnot. But on the international stage, right? I mean, if you wanted to follow, for the prelude to the '86 World Cup, as well as much of the qualifying games for the leading up to the '90 World Cup, as an English-speaking American soccer fan, not many of them out there at that time, right?
Right.
You'd have to watch, the predecessor to Univision, SAENA or SIN, the Spanish International Network, and Tony Torrado, and speaking in very heavy Spanish, and through the very fuzzy reception of often a UHF channel, just to just to even see this thing and even understand
Right.
what was going on, right? So in
Right,
some respect, not only was the game and Caligiuri's goal and all that a breakthrough, but frankly, you were basically part of that sort of step out, if you will, of
Yeah.
U.S. English broadcast of soccer.
And imagine we had no social media back then. So it was still a significant achievement back then. But since that time, now you have social media, right? Now you have all of these games from all around the world. You can't say to me, boy, I wish I could watch this game, because you can, right? Somebody did this note, I think it was last year. Someone said you could watch more EPL games if you lived in the United States than you could if you lived in England, which was shocking to me, but it was true. So we're kind of spoiled, thankfully, now. But back then, when I'm doing soccer, like I said, you're doing the MISL game of the week, and you're like the lead soccer guy, because that's all we had. We didn't have the outdoor game like we have it now. So now we have all of these MLS teams and a league that's growing and may get up to 30 teams at some point. A lot of good, exciting broadcasters, analysts, former players that are now getting into it, and we can still watch the greatest games from around the world, whether it's international friendlies, UEFA Champions League, Club World Cup, whatever it is, various leagues. Bundesliga is on, Serie A, EPL, La Liga. You can watch the French league. I mean, there's no league. If you want to watch it, you'll find it. And I think that's great now, especially for the younger fans that we're trying to cultivate.
So were you sensing that the Major League Soccer thing, obviously tied to what was supposed to be the legacy of the '94 World Cup, obviously the beginnings of that, underway and stuff. I got to imagine you thought that it would be an opportunity not only for other broadcasters, but yourself in particular, given your seniority, shall we say, in the sport of soccer in this country, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Well, by 96 now, I had done 86 World Cup, 90 World Cup, 94 World Cup on radio. So, I'm 3 World Cups in. So, yeah, I mean, I figured I would definitely be involved. I didn't know where. I thought I would actually be the first voice of the Metro Stars, but I was doing something else back then, and I was going to miss some games. I know what it was. It was Chicago Wolves. At that time, it was the International Hockey League.
Sure.
And I had told the Metro Stars people, I might miss like the first game or the second game, whatever it was. And there was some kind of miscommunication, whatever it was. And, they said, no, that's okay. I had heard later he was going to miss too many games. It was like 1 or 2 games I was going to miss. So I ended up being the first voice of the Columbus Crew. And I worked those games the first year with Ty Keogh. I think the second year was with Bill McDermott. And it was fun back in those days. Columbus Crew and that old logo they had that looked like what the Village people used to say.
Sure. And also
the hardest working team, right?
Yeah,
the hardest working team.
Yeah, and obviously in the old Ohio Stadium, well, not the old Ohio Stadium, but the Ohio State University Stadium, right, which is just gigantic and narrow, right? Do you remember how narrow that field was? Yeah,
but the funny thing is I never did a game out of there. We only did road games that first year and second year. So I've never been inside of that stadium.
That's interesting. Well, so clearly you're sticking around the sport, and so clearly though hockey and soccer are kind of like your go-tos, right? That you're essentially known for and getting your significant work with. How does the WUSA come about in the early 2000s? Right, that's a nice fledgling league. Right, and the story, the money behind that, right, was significant, right?
It was. Yeah, it was supposed to last longer than it did, but it didn't. But back then, let's see, you're going back to what, 2000 was, So I'm at the top at that point, right? I'm doing the 1999 Women's World Cup, so I was probably the only choice back then, to do the games because of 99, and
sorry,
by 99,
we should probably back up, right? I did overlook that, right? 99, right, was clearly another seminal moment in your career. You mentioned it earlier.
Yeah.
For those who
I had done the 95 World Cup first, the
Sure.
World Cup in Sweden, and then 99. So by the time 2000 came along, I had done 2 Women's World Cups. And back then, the women were not on television all that much. So I was probably, I don't want to say I was the only guy doing them, but there weren't many.
But obviously, too, the iconic call of that final game and Brandi Chastain with the sports bra that launched 1,000 covers. I mean, another iconic moment, right? I mean, for you and for the sport.
Yeah. Well, I take nothing for granted. I think I've been very fortunate. I mean, I've worked hard to get where I am, but I think I've also been very fortunate. You have to be in the right place at the right time to have those situations. And the Chastain, the Women's World Cup was fantastic, right? It's on ESPN. That tournament, when they first thought about having the Women's World Cup here, originally they talked about high school stadiums and college stadiums. And then Marla Messing, I give credit to, she was running it. She was the leader of it. And she thought, Americans are big-time sports people. They like the big sports, like Olympics, World Cups. This is who we are. We can fill these stadiums. We can go into bigger stadiums. And they did. And I watched that tournament grow from the TV commercials that they used to do to appearances on the David Letterman show. They were on the nightly news. And it was such a big buildup all the way. Thousands of people going to the games, more and more people watching them on television. And when the World Cup first started, Women's World Cup, people asked me, did the U.S. have to win it for it to be successful? And I said, no, they don't have to win it. But I said, I do think they have to get to the final. They can't be knocked out in the quarters, certainly. But I do think they have to get to the final. But when we got to that stage, I had changed my mind. I said, well, now they got to win it, right? Because this was such a high that even though I still think it would have been a success, I might have been in the minority saying it was a great World Cup or a successful World Cup if China had won that game instead of the U.S. I still think sometimes we define too much in terms of winning and losing. When people tell me that Lionel Messi, his legacy might be tarnished if he doesn't win a World Cup, seriously? He could be the greatest player of all time. Could be. I'm not saying he is, but he could be. It's not his fault that he hasn't won a World Cup to this point. A lot of great players in many sports don't lift championship trophies. So a lot of people might have thought that would have been a failure if the U.S. didn't win, but they won, and in dramatic fashion, right? I mean, you couldn't have written a better script to that. Could not have. It was not possible to write a better script.
And I apologize. I did not watch that game on television and hear your call until after, because I was in the stands. And yes,
that's cool.
Electric,
That's
right?
cool.
And okay,
Yeah.
so let me ask you this then. Okay, so having been in that moment, been part of now 2 major Women's World Cup presentations and the dramatic, shall we say, exclamation point at the end of the tournament in 1999,
Right.
Why then the WUSA and its 3-year multi-million-dollar fail, shall we say? It seems like it was teed up to succeed.
Yeah, a lot of reasons why it failed. I think one was back in those days, they wanted nothing to do with Major League Soccer. And I think Major League Soccer by then had gone, 4 years into their operations. And the women, I think, because they were so successful, and remember, this is coming off 1998 Men's World Cup where USA finished last. So here are the women with all of this popularity and power, if you will, so they could call the shots, right? And they wanted to do it on their own, and the organizers behind it didn't want MLS involvement. They thought that was the way to go. And so I think that was one mistake. I think playing in some of the bigger venues was another mistake because it was very costly. And then they try to emulate some MLS teams with huge staffs. And there were some executives back there that were making a lot of money. And I think that, and also the players are making very good money. Compared to today, the women in the NWSL, nowhere near the money that was being paid back in 2000. So I'm trying to remember. I think they had money that was supposed to last them 5 years, I think, and by the third year, they were wiped out. So I think there were a lot of mistakes made. No MLS involvement, I think, was one. The staffs were big and expensive. The stadiums, in some cases, were very expensive. Players' costs were expensive, and they wanted to their credit, they wanted to do it right, but maybe they should have taken smaller steps instead of larger steps. I still think the league was very good, and very competitive, and it was, even though it was in its first year, considered the best league in the world because we had all the best players.
Well, and your broadcasts certainly hold up very well too. Anybody just goes on YouTube and sees, like for example, the final on TNT. I mean, those games were very well produced as well, right? So it wasn't for a lack of that part of the equation either.
No, Turner was the television partner the year that I did it in 2000, and the Turner Network is fantastic. I've had great experiences with them, 1990 World Cup, and later working with them with the Atlanta Thrashers. So they always treat it like it's a big deal, and they gave the game the respect that it needed. I think the only bad part was you'd have to research this too, but I can remember like some really early kickoffs. I remember like noon kickoffs, which is a tough time, I think, on a Saturday to get viewers. So I think that the games were very, very well produced and directed, extremely well done, but I don't think our ratings reflected the kind of shows that we put out there.
All right, well, let me ask you this sort of like this two-part question, and it's actually related. So you've explained a whole bunch of different sort of ports of call, shall we say, in your professional career, which I think in many respects is very indicative of, and maybe it's a little less so now, or maybe it still is. So it's sort of the, dare I call it, peripatetic nature of broadcasting in sports, right? To become the voice of something, right? It almost seems like it's a it's almost like a holy grail in some respects, right? Because it probably establishes some level of continuity and be able to root yourself. I guess what I'm really curious is, and this is going to lead obviously into the Thrashers, right? Because here you are going, back and forth from soccer now into hockey for an extended period of time with the Thrashers. Maybe our audience could benefit from just a little bit of a sense of what is the life of a professional sports broadcaster, right? Because, I think people have this sort of perhaps incorrect perception that, today, obviously you're part of the Fox Sports Broadcasting group and probably contractually so, but it's not always sort of easy. I think many people don't realize that there's a lot of it is, I want to say gig to gig, but it's you're constantly looking or looking for scenarios and situations and broadcast opportunities that, aren't necessarily rooted in, long-term viability or sustainability, right? Right.
There's very few, like 5-year contracts in our world, right? I mean, when you see guys that have lasted with one network for so many years, it's not because they had like a 20-year contract. It's maybe they had 3 years here, then they got a 4-year deal, then they got a 5-year deal, whatever that is, right? But, those are, that's the Bob Costas of the world, the Al Michaels of the world. They're guys that, can be affiliated. And Al Michaels wasn't on one network, but he's had a long and distinguished career, one of the all-time greats. But I think when you're in broadcasting, you're always focused on what you're doing. You should be anyway, because if not, you're not going to get better at what you do, right? So you're focused on that job. But you're always thinking about other opportunities, right? You're not even looking for them, but you hear about something and then you think, boy, I wonder if I should apply for that. Or somebody calls you and says, this thing is opening up. You think you might have an interest, and you think, I'm happy here, but that's interesting, right? That's very interesting. So, to connect you to like the Thrashers part of it, here I spent 10 years in minor league hockey. I came so close to various NHL jobs that I did not get. And a lot of the guys that I was in the minor leagues with ended up and are still working with the NHL clubs that they got those jobs with. And back then, NHL was probably, I want to say maybe 16 teams, so, and some of them were Canadian, right? So not many opportunities would open up in the NHL. So when I left and I did indoor soccer, I put the hockey stuff on hold. Then I told you I did some college basketball. I did some minor league hockey with the Wolves. Again, that was a situation where, as I remember now, Randy Hahn, a friend of mine from soccer, was the voice of the San Jose Sharks, and he was going to do, they called him and asked if he was available, if he knew anybody for the Chicago Wolves. And Randy thought of me, put me in touch with them, and I think it was 2 years with the Wolves. And they ran that team like an NHL team, and it gave me another fix for hockey. And back then, I also did the IHL Game of the Week, International Hockey League. And then that was it for a while. I did no more hockey for quite a few years. And then I get a phone call one day from a guy that I worked with in Italy, 1990 World Cup. He was like an associate producer back then, and now he's running Turner Sports. And he calls me and he says, the Thrashers play-by-play guy is going to miss some games. I know you have a hockey background. Would you like to do them? And I said, sure. The announcer was in the process of adopting a child from another country and was going to miss some games. So I said, sure, I'll do it. So I think I did 5 games with the Thrashers, and I thought, wow, this is fantastic. But I knew it was a fill-in, and that was it. That's all that it was. And then a few years later, he called me again, and he said, listen, this job is opening up. Don't know if you're interested, but if you are, you'll be a very serious candidate for it. I need to know if you're interested. And I thought, sure. This was, I wasn't going to give up on soccer, not at all. But my dream was really, my dream was to be an NHL guy initially. Then it became, the soccer. And then the real dream was, wow, could I do them both? And the Turner thing gave me that opportunity. And back then I was also working for the Metro Stars at that time, and then into the Red Bulls. And that was probably, I've had so many great memories, and I've worked with so many great organizations, teams, and people. But I would say if I had to look at career-wise, the happiest time of my life, I would say it was those 5 years where I was combining working with Thrashers and then Metro Stars / Red Bulls, because I had the best of both worlds, the two sports that I loved the most, and I was able to do them both and make good money on both, with contracts with both teams. So it was all good at that point.
All right, well, we'll round the corner here. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but so maybe your insights, what is it about hockey in Atlanta then, right? I mean, by the way, your broadcasts for the Thrashers games, the pieces that are still out there, and there's not a lot of them, frankly. I don't know. Somebody from the old Sports South archives department has not been on YouTube lately, but the excitement in your call, it's clear that you are a hockey pro by all accounts.
Thank you.
And your enthusiasm is just, it's fantastic. I'm just curious as to your perception, right? That was the second go round for pro or the big league NHL hockey in Atlanta. Why do you think it didn't stick? Was it because of the sport and the region, or do you think it was other things like the way it was managed and or I don't know, other things?
They laugh. I laugh now when I hear people say Atlanta's a bad sports city. Really? Atlanta United's getting 50,000 people a game.
I don't think anybody saw that coming.
To come to the games, right?
Saw that coming, right?
Well, I didn't see it coming until I heard how many season tickets that they had sold. Then I saw it coming. But it's not a bad sports city. And what people forget about the Thrashers is that on the weekends, we would get the 16,000 people to come into the game, 17,000 people to come in. It was the Tuesday night games, the Wednesday night games, the Thursday night games where, you're looking at 10,000 people maybe, at those games. But I think the failure of the Thrashers, I can put it this way, Turner owned the team. And if Turner still owned the team, I think that they would have been fine because Turner runs it a certain way. And I think that they would have been more committed to it from a business sense. When Turner sold it, It was a group of people that came in, and no disrespect to any of them, as individuals or as business people, because they were all successful. But in my opinion, they were not the right people for it. They were not hockey people making hockey decisions. I don't think they were as well funded, maybe, as they could have been. We had some good players there. We had Ilya Kovalchuk in his prime playing at the same time as Marian Hossa. And we lost them both, had to trade them because, they wanted out because they didn't see anything working in Atlanta. They made the playoffs once, and they're out in 4 straight games against the Rangers. So, they never had the success. I mean, they had a lot of tragedy too. I mean, remember the car accident? Danny Heatley was involved in it, and Dan Snyder died. I think it was a week before the season started, something like that. That was my first game was with Atlanta. Moment of silence for Dan Snyder, and paying tribute to that young skater who lost his life. That's the way my career started, in Atlanta with the Thrashers. So there were a lot of things that were, bad luck. But I think if they had the kind of ownership that we see in some of these successful places, I do think it could have worked there for sure. There's so many people from not just Atlanta, transplants from all over, especially the Northeast and the hockey country and Canadians. So there's no doubt in my mind if it was run well that they would still be there. So it's unfortunate because, when you look at these teams right now, Arizona Coyotes, they're not doing any better than the Thrashers attendance-wise. If you look at the numbers, Florida Panthers, Carolina Hurricanes, a lot of empty seats in those stadiums. Atlanta, not there anymore because somebody wants to buy them and move them out. Whereas in some of these other cities, in Arizona, all kinds of problems, right? But they've not moved them out of there. Carolina just has a new owner now. Peter Carmanos, kept them in there for a long, long time. And now he's got a new owner there, but new owners talking about getting it done in Carolina. And the Panthers have had ownership changes too. We've seen that throughout the NHL. But in Atlanta, they didn't have somebody in the city that said, I'll take this over. I'll buy it. I'll run it. I mean, if Arthur Blank had run the Atlanta Thrashers, it'd still be there, and there'd be a playoff team.
All right. Well, 2 questions. One directly related, and then we'll get to we'll end it with your sort of World Cup observations as you get ready for Russia in a couple of weeks. So you're talking about the NHL, and actually, ironically, this week's episode that we have up there posted out in podcast land is with these 2 guys out in Hartford called the Whaler guys, who won't let go of the dream about returning the Whalers somehow back to Hartford, and some call it a pipe dream, some call it, but they are very tenacious, and you wonder that passion, right, which is very genuine, versus, let's say, an artificially plopped down franchise like some of which you mentioned. But for that sort of hockey lust, I guess, for any pro broadcaster like yourself or a player, right? Seattle seems like it's going to beckon for $600 million, right? So I guess I wonder. And maybe not sort of your opinions on the NHL, but it's interesting, right? You see how many franchises and now and Las Vegas. Geez, what an amazing story that truly I don't think anybody saw coming this year.
No, nobody did. Nobody did. Nobody even in Vegas saw that one coming.
No,
really.
Agreed. And so, but
you'd be lying if you said that. If you said you knew this was going to happen, you'd be lying.
No, sure. And how many teams can the NHL support? And now you look at and juxtapose that, say, with MLS. So this is my wind up here for your opinions on sort of the state of Major League Soccer, right? And nothing is perfect. Right? We haven't made the World Cup this year. And there are people who grouse about sort of the central ownership of the league and all that. And there are clearly teams in MLS, right, going on 24 plus teams. Are we possibly maybe reaching a saturation point, NHL, MLS, or is this just sort of the nature of the beast and maybe a sign of just the maturity that we're finally at now with this pro level of soccer in this country?
Yeah, I think it's the nature of the beast. And NHL really didn't want to expand, right? But if Seattle wants to pay $500 million, these guys are not stupid. I mean, you have to find new revenue streams, right? Because if you're like, let's say you're an NHL owner and you're filling your building, where else are you going? You've got national television money, you've got your local television money, regional television money, but now you need more money, right, to operate. So, like, what's the next level? Where are you going to go? Well, divide $500 million with all of these owners, and they don't have to do anything. And now, I think now they're more ready to accept expansion when they see what Vegas can do. Seattle's ready to come in. Houston wants to come in, from what I've read. You still have Quebec City dangling out there. I don't want to burst the bubble of the Hartford guys, because I was a Whalers season ticket holder, but we don't have a stadium. Our building is old, needs to be either torn down and have a new one, or spend a massive amount of money to get it to NHL standards. And when you have competition like you have in some of these other places, and look at the building in Kansas City. Everyone thought they were going to get an NHL team years ago, right? They have no NHL, no NBA, and they might have they probably have the best building in the United States, which has no major tenant in it. Yep. I would say. Yep. Because every major building, right, in any major city would have at least an NHL or an NBA team in there, and they don't. So, and they would be ahead of Hartford too. So I think there's a lot of interest here for sure. If we had a 17,000 new stadium here, and somebody with deep pockets, sure, it could happen. It could happen, but we're way behind so many other cities. But I admire those guys and their passion for it. I think that's great. You still see Hartford Whalers jerseys all over, not just here, but in other parts of the country. I think they're number one in merchandise sold for defunct NHL teams.
And how,
by a wide margin.
And what of MLS, right? Are we reaching a saturation point there, or is the sky the limit still for?
You mean when you say saturation point? Do you mean number of teams?
Yeah,
Yeah. Well, I think it comes down to this, right? Promotion relegation. It's not going to happen. So it's not happening in our lifetime, in my opinion. Not under the present structure. I mean, if you're spending the kind of money that these guys have spent, imagine a new team coming into MLS, and let's say they're going to pay $200 million to get in. And they know that if they don't do well this year, they're going to get relegated, and they're going to be playing in the second division. They're not signing up for that. They're not. And the guys that are already in it, like if you asked, let's say Atlanta United, are you guys for promotion relegation? They might say, sure, that's fine with us, because they're not going to be relegated. But talk to some of the other teams, talk to the bottom 10 teams in Major League Soccer, and ask them how they would feel about playing in the second division. You don't have the balloon payments that you have over in Europe. I'm not against promotion relegation, not at all. I just know from knowing what we're dealing with here that that's not an option involving Major League Soccer. So I think at some point what MLS has to do is either create some form of promotion relegation to justify how many teams they're going to have, or they may end up doing this, and I know they don't really want to do this, but if they become so big, they might have to say the East just plays against the East and the West just plays against the West. 2 games against each team, and then you meet again in whatever playoffs that you have. Because otherwise, how is the schedule going to be fair? If you have 30 teams and you're going to play a 34-game schedule, I mean, what are you supposed to do? Some team has an unlucky schedule. Well, I guess like the NFL, right? Based on record, you're scheduled the next year. But with MLS, with the way the rosters change too, I'm not sure how. But I think the sky is the limit for Major League Soccer. A lot of great cities out there, but I do think they need to cap it at a certain point. I'd like to see the NASL come back and be strong. There's a lot of great cities in our country that may not be up to MLS standards, but just a notch below it. And it'll make us all stronger. We don't need promotion relegation to be successful. We don't have to be like other leagues around the world. But, if we want to have promotion relegation, you have to figure out a way that it works for the guys that have invested money in this league. And, one of the groups that would not want promotion relegation would be New England. But let me tell you, the Kraft family, since 1996, just do the math. How many millions and millions and millions of dollars do you think that they have spent on soccer? And do they want to be relegated? How are they going to get people to go? If they became a USL franchise, what do you think their attendance would be? If it's 18,000 a game now or somewhere in that area, where would it be in the USL where you're not seeing, opponents come in like a David Villa or a Zlatan or Jovinko, guys that sell tickets. You don't have those guys in USL or NASL for that matter. So these guys don't want promotion relegation. That's why I don't think we'll see it. But I think as MLS finds other ways to spend money, bring in better players, younger players. I mean, this league has improved leaps and bounds on the field and off the field. And like I said, I think the sky is the limit, but nobody wants to see a 40-team MLS. At least I don't. I don't want to see a 40-team MLS. So I'm hoping they cap it at a certain point and then figure out a way to make it competitive, not have the season end with a final in December, figure out a better way to make the schedule work. I'm all for playoffs. So I don't even mind a single table. I don't mind any of that stuff. I just think that the season itself is too long. We shouldn't be playing our MLS Cup match in December. It should be done long before then.
No, I agree. And it just kind of makes a travesty of the entire season, frankly, when you're playing in sub-zero temperatures. So, but isn't that interesting though, given especially your history with the sport, right? That we're having this conversation about, should we do pro rel or we have too many teams and, a substantial second and third, tier infrastructure, I mean, would you ever have imagined this kind of conversation 20, even 30 years ago?
No, great problems, right? I mean, hey, we didn't qualify for the World Cup, right? We didn't qualify. We could either do a couple of things, right? We can cry about it and not learn from our mistakes and not get better as a nation, or we can say we don't have to blow it up. Yes, we have to tweak it. Yes, we need to improve in these areas. Let's get it going right now. Let's get it started. Let's bring in some younger players. Let's do this. Let's have all of our teams playing a certain style. Let's develop a better culture. We can do all of that stuff, right? Let's be positive. Italy didn't make the World Cup. It's a bigger tragedy there than it is in the U.S. U.S. fans may not believe it, but when Italy didn't make it, it was a much bigger tragedy there than it was here in the United States. And Argentina qualified on the last day. So it happens. It's not a God-given right that we qualify for the World Cup. Yes, we're better than we showed in CONCACAF. To me, right now, Mexico is the best team in CONCACAF. Costa Rica is next. I think the U.S. is third as we speak today, but they're not where they finished in CONCACAF in qualifying. They're certainly not that. At the very worst, they're the third best team. But I think that's probably an accurate reflection of where we are right now as a country. You can't say that we're better than Mexico or Costa Rica. That's, you could have that opinion, but I think that's tough to back that up.
Yeah, but the fact that we've got a thriving pro league, it's on 22 years on, we're on now, and it's amazing. I mean, it's just amazing. You think back to your earliest days at the NASL, the ASL, and the MISL, right? And those dark years when there wasn't even an MISL, and the sort of prelude to the World Cup in '94. I mean, we've come a long way in a fairly short period of time. I think it's hard to not remember that and recognize that we have come that far, and many things that were just not even possibly conceivable.
No, look at the players we're bringing in now. Look at the players. I mean, do you think even in 2006, pick a year, 2008, did you think you'd get a player like Sebastian Jovinko that would come over here? Did you think you could get a player like a Miguel Almiron that looks like, a rising star? Did you think somebody would spend $15 million on Barco? Nobody would have thought that. $15 million for one player? I mean, look at what some of these teams' player budgets are total. $15 million is a lot of cash for one player. This is a teenager that they spent that money on, by the way. So MLS is growing leaps and bounds. There's a lot more to be thankful for. There's a lot more to be optimistic for. You know, you can be negative if you want. I'm not drinking the Kool-Aid. I do think there's things that we'd like to see better, certainly, in our sport. But when you weigh the pluses and the minuses, a bigger edge in the plus category for Major League Soccer.
All right, last question. You're getting ready for one of your biggest assignments yet. You're going to be spending almost a whole month now in Russia covering the World Cup for Fox for the first time. They're carrying this package. I think you're teamed up with Tony Meola in the broadcast booth. Is that correct?
Yes, I am. So here's how this comes like full cycle, right? I'm calling games. Tony's playing in them, including that game in 1989. Now I'm working with Tony in the booth.
And that's an amazing arc, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it's great. You know, I mean, to watch these guys grow. I've watched Tony, John Harkes, Tab Ramos. I've watched them grow as players. I've watched them grow as coaches, as fathers. As people. It's fantastic to see what they've done with their lives. And Tony and I will be together for probably like 40 days. We have to go the week before the World Cup starts. We have the first game, Russia, Saudi Arabia. We have some other big games, including Germany, Mexico, that I'm looking forward to. And we'll see some of the bigger teams in the group stage, and that's all we know right now. Don't know what our schedule will be. Come the knockout round, there'll be a lot of factors that go into that. But I'm looking forward to it. I'm always excited when I'm doing a World Cup. I never know when it's going to be my last one. I mean, this could be it. Next year's Women's World Cup could be it, or there could be another one. I have no idea. Like I said, I try to live in the present with the career, because we never know, what's out there next, right? Like, nobody knew that Fox was going to get 3 straight World Cups. Nobody knew that ESPN was going to lose it. Nobody knew that Turner was going to end up with the Champions League next year. Like, we don't know. The broadcasting world changes on a daily basis, right? ESPN bought, the Fox regionals. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that's happening, all the streaming that's going on, YouTube's involvement. It changes daily. So we know we should be thankful for the opportunities we get, which I am. And I'm thankful for this opportunity to go to Russia and be one of the announcers for Fox. I think they're going to do a great job. They spent a fortune on it. They're committed to it. They're dedicated to it. And they want this to be one of the best World Cups ever. And I hope we can make it that.
Okay, there it is. Our great conversation. We appreciate it with JP Dellacamera, who you will hear alongside Tony Meola as one of the broadcast teams covering many of the major games in the FIFA World Cup in Russia. It starts in a few days. Depending on when you're hearing this little podcast, it could be well underway, the tournament. Hell, it could be already over, and I don't know who won. Be nice to know. But we're recording this way ahead of the tournament actually beginning. So who knows? But hopefully it is or was a great tournament. JP obviously has a tremendous heritage of calling games from all kinds of sports, but certainly in soccer, certainly in hockey, and some of the stops I was even completely unaware of. But if anybody is qualified to be called the dean of soccer broadcasters in the United States, it is absolutely JP Dellacamera, and we thank him tremendously. It was a real treat to talk to him. I couldn't appreciate it more, and hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Let's see, as we segue out of our episode this week, we do want to thank you all kindly for all your suggestions and your tweets and your social media banter back and forth. We love it when you're interacting with the show. And of course, if you want to find out more about the show or past episodes, or search for things that you thought you might have heard or you didn't know existed before in our dozens of episodes, by all means, go to our website. That's goodseatsstillavailable.com. There you're going to find every single episode we've ever done. You're going to find links to all the books and promotional goodies, as well as all of our social feeds. You can find us on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You will find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. You will find us On Facebook, there's a page devoted to us. On the website, our website, you will find our email address, and you will also find a link to join our email newsletter. That's a great way for you to be reminded every week as to who's on the show, a little bit of a snippet of such, and a quick link or something you can pass along to your friends and let them know that they should be listening this week as well. That's all I got for this week. And of course, I want to thank our friend Jerry Payne at Podfly Productions, podfly.net. If you need help with podcasting and production and editing and all that kind of stuff, Podfly Productions is the place to go. And you can find all the information about them at podfly.net. All right, that's it for this week. Enjoy the soccer, everybody. And we'll see you next week with another fun-filled episode. God knows from what sport, from what team, what league, whatever. But it should be, I hope, fun and enjoyable and a learning experience for one and all. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.